Good evening. Welcome back to Quiet History. Tonight we're going to England in the year 878, to an ordinary village on the night Viking ships came ashore. Families fled, fires rose, and life changed before sunrise. Dim the lights. Get comfortable. Let's begin.
A brief note before we begin. The family and village in tonight's story are a historical reconstruction created from what is known about ordinary life in 9th century Wessex. Their names and this exact night were not recorded in a surviving chronicle, but the homes, work, routines, fears, and Viking threat described here are grounded in the world people of Anglo-Saxon England actually inhabited. The smoke did not smell like supper. That was the thing Wulfric would remember afterward, though in the moment he barely registered it at all, a thin thread of something acrid drifting on the evening air, faint beneath the familiar smell of peat and hearth smoke rising from the village roofs. It was there, and then it was gone, carried off by the breeze coming down off the low hills to the west, and he told himself it was nothing. A neighbour burning damp wood perhaps, or someone's fire drawing poorly in the evening damp. But smoke has a memory to it if you have lived close to fire your whole life the way Wulfric had. Hearth smoke is soft and grey and smells of home. This was sharper, darker. It came from somewhere beyond the tree line that bordered the water meadow, beyond the place where the village's world quietly ended and the wilder country began. He stood a moment longer at the gate of the goat pen, one hand resting on the rough wood, and let his eyes drift toward the darkening line of alder and ash that marked the edge of the known world. Somewhere out there, something was burning that was not a hearth fire. He did not yet know what. He would not know for hours yet. Not until a rider came pounding down the trackway with news that would turn this ordinary evening into something else entirely. But that comes later. For now, the smell passed, thinned by wind, and Wulfric turned back to the yard where his family waited, and the evening went on as evenings always had. It was late summer in the year that men would later mark as 878, though no one in the village counted years that way in daily speech. They spoke instead of seasons of the barley harvest just past, of the feast days that shaped the turning wheel of the year. The light was long and gold, the kind of light that comes in the hour before true dusk, when the shadows of the houses stretch thin across the beaten earth of the village green, and the swallows begin their low, darting hunts above the roof thatch. Wulfric's holding sat near the edge of the settlement, close enough to the common green that he could hear the low murmur of neighbours finishing their own evening chores, far enough that his own patch of ground, house, byre, small kitchen garden, and the pen where the goats and the single milking cow were kept, felt like its own small kingdom. The house itself was modest but sound, a single long room built of timber posts and wattle and daub walls, its roof thick with rye straw thatch that had weathered to a soft grey brown, a smoke hole cut above the central hearth pit, where a thin column of smoke, the ordinary kind, the good kind, rose steadily into the evening sky. His wife, whose name was Ealhswith, though he most often simply called her by love names worn smooth with years of use, was already at the hearth when he came in, from securing the animals, coaxing the fire up from its afternoon bed of coals. She had a quick, economical way of moving that came from a lifetime of work, feeding the fire, feeling the weight of a grain sack, judging the weather by the colour of the western sky, and she did not look up when he entered, only asked in the easy shorthand of long marriage whether the goats had settled and whether he'd seen the shoat route up the fence post again. He'd mend it properly tomorrow, he told her, though they both understood this to mean he would patch it again with whatever came to hand, and mend it properly some other tomorrow that might never quite arrive. This was the rhythm of their life together. Small promises, small postponements, the accumulated business of simply continuing. Their children were about the yard in the day's last light, the elder, a boy of perhaps 10 summers, with his father's watchful eyes and his mother's quickness of hand. Was finishing the task of driving the last of the hens into their coop, counting them under his breath, the way his mother had taught him, touching each small feathered body lightly on the head as it passed, as though the touch itself completed the count. The younger, a girl not yet 7, sat on the worn threshold stone of the house, absorbed in the serious work of feeding scraps to a scrawny, grey, muzzled village dog who had adopted their household some winters back and never quite left. The dog's name, for whatever reason, children give names to things, was Grip, though he had long since lost whatever ferocity the name implied, and spent his days now in a state of comfortable, arthritic devotion to the family that fed him. He would matter later in a small way. Dogs often do in stories like this one. But for now he simply gnawed at the crust the girl had given him, tail thumping once against the worn stone, entirely unremarkable. To understand the shape of that evening and the ones that would follow, it helps to understand the shape of the village itself, for it was not a large place, nor a grand one, but it was whole in the way small communities of that age were whole, everything within it serving a purpose, everything known to everyone. At its heart lay the green, a rough triangle of common ground kept short by the grazing of a few shared animals, and at its centre stood the well, a simple affair of timber and stone, its bucket worn smooth by generations of hands, around which the daily business of gossip and water drawing had always mingled inseparably. From the green, footpaths worn into the earth by centuries of repetition led outward, like the spokes of a wheel, one toward the mill by the stream, one toward the fields that stretched beyond the village in their long cultivated strips, one toward the water meadow and the tree line beyond, and one the shortest, and in some ways the most important, toward the small wooden church that stood at the northern edge of the green. The church was nothing grand, no stone tower, no carved doorways, simply a timber-built hall somewhat larger than the houses around it, its roof a little steeper, a small wooden cross fixed above its door, and within it a modest bell, rung each day to mark the hours of prayer that shaped the community's sense of time as surely as sunrise and sunset did. That bell would ring tonight at an hour it had never rung before, but that too belongs to later. For now, in this long gold hour before true dusk, the bell hung silent, and the priest, an older man named Father Oswin, thin and stooped and kindly, who had served this small flock for longer than some of them had been alive, was likely doing what he did most evenings, walking the boundary of the churchyard with slow, contemplative steps, saying the evening office quietly to himself before full dark fell. Around the green, perhaps a dozen households like Wulfric's went through their own versions of this same evening ritual. Smoke rose from a dozen roof holes into the softening sky. Livestock were counted and penned. Water was drawn for the night's cooking. Somewhere a woman's voice called a child's name twice, sharply, and was answered. Somewhere else, two men who had been mending a hurdle fence together straightened their backs, exchanged a few final words about the next day's work, and parted with the unhurried courtesy of men who expected to see each other again in a few hours, and then again the next morning, and the morning after that, in the manner of people who have never known any other way of living. This was the texture of ordinary life in a Wessex village in the later years of the 9th century, a life built from small, repeated certainties, the turning of the agricultural year, tracked not by numbers on a calendar, but by saints' days, and the visible state of the fields. The rhythm of the church bell marking morning and evening prayer, the particular hard-won comfort of a house that kept the rain out and the fire in, of a hearth that had warmed one's parents and would, if the fates allowed, warm one's children in turn. It was not always an easy life. Wulfric's hands, calloused and cracked at the knuckles, spoke plainly enough of that, as did the patched elbows of his rust-brown wool tunic, mended so many times that the original cloth was almost a memory beneath the stitching. But it was a known life, a life whose dangers, bad weather, poor harvests, sickness, the ordinary griefs of a hard age, were at least familiar dangers, the kind a careful, watchful man could brace against through work and preparation rather than helplessness. Wulfric was, above all things, a careful man, not fearful. His neighbours would not have called him that, nor would his wife, who had married him precisely for the quiet steadiness that showed itself in small ways, the fence mended before it truly needed mending, the extra measure of grain set aside against a poor season, the habit of walking the boundary of his own holding each evening simply to see that all was as it should be. He was not a man given to great pronouncements or visible worry. He simply watched and noticed and acted quietly on what he noticed, which was in its own understated way, its own kind of courage, the ordinary kind that rarely gets remembered in the grand tellings of history, though it is the kind that held households together through countless unremarkable nights across the whole breadth of that uncertain age. And so, as the light continued its long slide toward evening, Wulfric finished his circuit of the yard, checked the goat pen once more from simple habit, and allowed himself for a moment, from simple habit, to simply stand in the gathering dusk and feel the ordinary rightness of it all. The smoke rising from his own roof hole, the voices of his children in the yard, the distant murmur of the village settling into its evening rhythm around him. It was in that stillness that the smell had come to him, that thin, sharp thread beneath the familiar peat smoke, gone again almost before he was sure he had noticed it at all. He would think of it again later that night when the church bell rang wrong and a rider came breathless down the trackway with news from upriver. But not yet. For now the light was still gold, the hens were counted, the goats were penned, and somewhere behind him in the house, Ealhswith was calling the children in for supper, her voice carrying easily across the quiet yard in the way voices do in the last hour before dark, ordinary, warm, entirely unaware of what the night still held. The pot had been hanging over the fire since before the sun dropped fully behind the western hills, and by the time Wulfric ducked through the low doorway of his house, the smell of it had already filled the single long room with something warm and faintly earthy, barley softening slowly in water, the first leeks going soft at their edges, the promise of peas still to come. This was supper most nights in Wulfric's household, as it was in nearly every household in the village. A thick pottage cooked slow over the hearth pit in an iron pot that had belonged to Ealhswith's mother before her, and to some woman before that, whose name had long since been forgotten, though the pot itself endured, black with decades of smoke, its rim slightly dented on one side from a fall no one now remembered. Barley was the base of nearly everything they ate, ground rough at the quernstone that sat in the corner of the house, or left whole and boiled soft in pottages like this one. Wheat was a finer grain, saved mostly for feast days or for trading, and rye had its uses too. But barley was the steady, unglamorous foundation of daily life, filling, forgiving of poor soil, and always, always in the pot. Tonight Ealhswith had added leeks pulled that afternoon from the strip of kitchen garden behind the house, their white ends still gritty with soil despite her rinsing, and a good handful of dried peas that had been soaking since morning in a wooden bowl by the door. There would be no meat in it tonight. Meat was for saints' days, for the occasional slaughtering of a pig too old or too troublesome to keep through winter, for the rare stroke of luck that put a hare in someone's snare. Most nights the pottage was simply grain and vegetable and water, thickened slowly by time and patience, seasoned with whatever herbs grew close enough to the door to be worth the bother of picking. Wulfric settled onto the low bench along the wall, easing the day's stiffness out of his shoulders, and watched his wife stir the pot with the long wooden spoon worn smooth by years of the same motion. The hearth pit sat at the centre of the room, a shallow depression lined with flat stones. The fire itself, built from a mix of wood and turfs, of peat cut and dried back in spring. Peat burned slower and gave a duller, thicker smoke than wood, but it held its heat well through the long hours of night, and wood was not always so easily spared. The smoke from the fire rose in a thin, ordinary column toward the hole cut in the roof above, some of it escaping cleanly, some of it drifting instead into the rafters and settling there in a soft grey haze that clung to the underside of the thatch, a haze so constant, so much a part of the house's atmosphere, that none of them noticed it any longer except as a faint sting in the eyes on the smokier nights, or the smokier nights, or the pish, particular smell that clung afterward to hair and wool, a smell that was, in its own way, simply the smell of home. Ealhswith's hands, like Wulfric's, showed the marks of the life she led, reddened by the water she drew each day, the knuckles slightly swollen, the nails kept short and practical. Her hair was bound back beneath a plain linen head covering, as was proper for a married woman, and her dress was a long woolen garment, the colour of undyed fleece, gone slightly grey with wear, belted at the waist with a woven cord from which hung a small pouch containing her needle and a few precious lengths of thread. While the pottage simmered, she had already turned her attention to the mending that seemed never quite finished in a household of 2 growing children. Tonight it was the boy's second tunic. Tonight it was the boy's second tunic, torn at the shoulder seam from some scramble through the hedge that he had been suspiciously vague about explaining. She worked the needle with quick, sure motions in the firelight, occasionally holding the cloth up toward the flames to check her stitching, while the boy himself sat nearby, working at a far less successful repair of his own, a leather thong on his shoe that had snapped clean through, and which he was attempting, with limited success, to knot back together. This was the shape of the evening hours in a household like theirs. A slow braiding together of small tasks and small talk, the kind of unhurried domestic rhythm that filled the space between the day's labour and the night's sleep. There was no reading in these hours, no books in a house like this one. Almost no one in the village could read at all, save perhaps Father Oswin, and imperfectly the reeve who kept account of Jews, and imperfectly the reeve who kept account of Jews, and book duties owed. Instead there was talk, the passing on of small news, old stories retold with the comfortable familiarity of things heard many times before, and once prompted by the girl's sleepy question about why they would go to church tomorrow, when it was not a Sunday, a small explanation of the saint's day soon approaching, a day when even the poorest household tried to set aside some small portion of better food, when the church bell would ring a little longer than usual, and when Father Oswin would speak of the saint's life and its lessons for ordinary people trying to live well in difficult times. Ealhswith answered the girl's question patiently, in the unhurried way of a mother filling the last waking hour of her child's day, explaining that the saints were like elder kin who had gone before into God's keeping, and that their days were kept not simply out of duty, but out of a kind of gratitude, a reminder that other, harder lives had been lived before theirs, and had still found their way through to something good at the end of it. The girl considered this with the particular seriousness of small children turning over large ideas, then asked whether Grip the dog had a saint's day too, which drew a low laugh from Wulfric on the bench, and a mock-serious answer from her mother that dogs, so far as she knew, kept their own kind of calendar, one built entirely around meal times. By the time the pottage was ready, thick enough now that the spoon stood nearly upright in it before Ealhswith tipped it to serve, the last of the daylight had faded from the smoke hole above, and the fire itself had become the room's only true light. casting long, moving shadows against the wattle and dull walls. They ate from shared wooden bowls, scooping the pottage with the small flat spoons carved from horn or wood that most households kept, and eating too, as was common, with a bit of coarse bread when there was any to spare. Tonight there was a heel of yesterday's rye loaf, divided carefully between the four of them. More gesture than substance, but welcome all the same. There was little formal conversation during the meal itself, which was eaten with the unhurried, comfortable quiet of people who had spent the whole day in each other's company and needed no performance of talk to feel close. The boy recounted, between mouthfuls of talk, feel close, some minor drama involving another village boy and a stray pig that had gotten into someone's turnip patch. The girl, half listening, was more interested in whether there might be a little extra pottage left for Grip. For Grip, who sat with patient, hopeful attention just beyond the hearth's warmth, well trained enough not to beg outright, but making his presence unmistakably known. When the meal was finished and the bowls set aside to be scraped clean by the dog, and then rinsed in the morning, Wulfric rose from the bench with the particular reluctance of a tired body that has grown fond of sitting, and said he would check the animals once more before full dark settled in. This too was part of the evening's fixed rhythm. A final walk to the byre and the pen, a final count of shapes in the dimness, a final test of the gate's latch, performed not out of any specific worry, but simply because it was the kind of thing a careful man did, every night without fail, the way another man might say a private prayer. The yard outside had cooled quickly with the sun gone, the sky above deepening from the sky above deepening from soft grey into a deeper blue-black, in which the first stars were just beginning to show themselves, faint and scattered. The cow shifted and huffed quietly in the byre as he passed, unbothered. The goats had settled into their usual huddle in the corner of their pen, and the shoat, mercifully, had not found any new gap in the fence to exploit. All was as it should be, ordinary. It was as he turned back toward the house that he noticed Grip. The old dog had followed him out, as he often did on these final rounds, moving now with the stiff, careful gait of an animal whose younger years were well behind him. But instead of trotting back toward the warmth of the house, Grip had stopped near the edge of the yard, facing the dark line of the tree line beyond the water meadow, the very same stretch of trees, though Wulfric did not consciously connect the two things in that moment, from which that thin, sharp thread of smoke had drifted earlier in the evening. The dog's ears were up, his body still, and from low in his throat came a single, brief growl. Not the sharp bark he gave at strangers on the trackway, nor the excited yip that greeted familiar neighbours, but something lower and more uncertain, the kind of sound an old dog makes when something at the very edge of his senses does not sit quite right with him. Wulfric paused, following the dog's gaze toward the dark tree line, where nothing at all was visible now beyond the vague, grey shapes of the nearest trees against the deepening sky. He listened for a moment, the ordinary night sounds of the village settling around him, a dog barking once, faintly, from somewhere near the mill, the soft rustle of wind through the hedge, and and heard nothing that seemed cause for concern. He clicked his tongue once, low, the small sound he used to call the dog back to him, and after a moment's hesitation, Grip turned, tail giving one uncertain wag, and padded back across the yard toward the house, the growl already forgotten, or at least set aside, in favor of the warmth waiting inside, and whatever scraps might yet be spared from the supper pot. Wulfric himself gave it little more thought. Dogs growled at foxes, at owls, at shadows that moved wrong in torchlight. It was, on any other night, nothing worth remarking on at all. He glanced once more toward the dark tree line, saw nothing, and turned back toward the glow of his own doorway, where firelight spilled warm and gold across the threshold stone. Inside, the evening's final small rituals were already underway. Ealhswith had begun laying out the sleeping platform along the rear wall of the house, a raised wooden frame built low to the ground, packed thick with fresh straw, brought in from the barn that very week, over which she spread the household's woolen blankets, coarse and heavy, woven in undyed shades of brown and grey, smelling faintly of lanolin and wood smoke. The children's excitement of the day had finally softened into drowsiness, the boy yawning over the last of his knotwork, the girl already half curled against the wall, with Grip settling with a contented grunt at her feet. Before sleep took them fully, there was the small, familiar shape of evening prayer, not elaborate, not lengthy, simply the quiet words that closed each day in households like theirs, a murmured thanks for the meal, for the roof for another day safely passed, and a request, gentle and unremarkable, for God's protection through the hours of dark that lay ahead. Wulfric added the fire's final banking himself, covering the glowing coals with ash to hold their heat through the night without flame, a task as automatic to him as breathing. The room settled into a deep, familiar dimness, lit only by the faint red glow beneath the ash. Outside, the village had gone quiet in its own turn, roof after roof, settling into darkness, smoke thinning to nothing against a sky now thick with stars. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the wind stirred faintly through leaves that none of them could see, and in the corner by the girl's feet, Grip lay with his head resting on his paws, ears twitching once, twice, toward the dark beyond the walls, before he too finally closed his eyes. The bell woke him before he understood why he was awake. Wulfric lay still for a moment in the darkness of the sleeping platform, the last threads of sleep unraveling slowly, and let the sound come again, a single sharp peal from the direction of the church, then another, too quick behind it, too urgent. Nothing at all like the slow, measured calling of the morning or evening office. Bells in his village had a grammar of their own, a rhythm every soul there had known since childhood. And this was not it. This was a bell rung by a hand that was frightened, or in haste, or both. Beside him, Ealhswith had already stirred, one hand instinctively finding his arm in the dark, and across the room he heard the dog Grip rise with a low, uneasy whine, claws scraping softly against the packed earth floor as he moved toward the door. The children did not wake at once. Sleep holds tighter on the young. But the boy shifted and murmured something unintelligible, and Wulfric found himself already sitting upright, already reaching for his shoes, before any conscious decision to do so had fully formed. He crossed to the door and pulled it open into a night gone strange. The sky above the village was still thick with stars, the moon riding high enough to throw pale, uncertain light across the green, but the quiet that should have belonged to this deep hour of night had been broken entirely. Doors were opening up and down the row of houses bordering the green, each one spilling a thin bar of firelight into the dark, and figures were emerging into the cold, men mostly, pulling tunics over their shoulders as they came, some with a stick or a hoe caught up out of pure instinct, the way a hand reaches for something solid when the mind has not yet caught up with the body's alarm. And still the bell rang on, uneven, insistent, carried on the night air, with a clarity that made it seem far louder than it truly was. It was into this scene, doors opening, voices beginning to murmur low across the green, the bell still tolling its wrong rhythm into the dark, that the rider came. They heard him before they saw him, the hard, uneven drum of hooves on the trackway that led in from the eastern side of the village, coming too fast for a night ride, too fast for anything but urgent news. Then the shape of him resolved out of the darkness. Hoarse, lathered and blowing hard, the rider himself slumped forward slightly with the particular exhaustion of a man who had ridden further and harder than either he or his mount was built for. He was known to some of them, a young man from a settlement 2 hours' ride upriver, the son of a household Wulfric, had traded barley for iron nails with more than once in years past, but even those who knew his face might have struggled to recognize him in that moment, so thoroughly had fear and exertion transformed his features. He half slid, half fell from the horse's back as it came to a stumbling halt near the well, and for a moment he simply stood there, one hand braced against the animal's heaving flank, gathering enough breath to make himself understood. What he brought was not a clear account so much as a scattering of fragments, the kind of broken, urgent report a frightened man delivers when he has ridden through darkness with only half-seen things pressing at his back. He spoke of ships. He did not know how many, 3, perhaps more, low and dark-hulled, seen from the high ground above the river crossing as the light was failing, moving upstream with the tide in a way that no honest trading vessel would trouble itself to do at that hour. He spoke of smoke, real smoke this time, unmistakable, rising thick and black from beyond the bend where a small settlement sat close to the water, a settlement he had passed on his ride and had not dared draw close enough to examine, though he had seen enough, in glimpses through the trees, to know it was no cook fire. He spoke, too, of shouting carried faintly on the wind as he'd ridden past at a distance, and of one other thing that seemed to catch in his throat more than the rest, a glimpse, brief and half imagined in the failing light, of shapes moving along the riverbank that were neither cattle nor familiar men. By the time he had finished, or finished as much as his ragged breath would allow, a good portion of the village had gathered close around him in the moonlight, Men in half-fastened tunics, women with shawls pulled hastily over their shoulders, children clinging sleepy and wide-eyed to their mothers' skirts. Father Oswin himself had come from the church, still holding the bell rope's end forgotten in one hand, his thin face drawn with the particular gravity of a man whose whole life had prepared him to offer comfort in exactly such an hour, and who now found the task, larger than any single evening's office of prayer could quite hold. It fell, as such things often did in a village of this size, to a handful of the older, steadier men, to shape the murmur of alarm into something more useful, and among them, quietly but unmistakably, was Wulfric. He did not raise his voice. That was not his way, even now. Even with the bell still ringing faintly in the back of his mind and his own children waiting behind him in a dark house, he moved instead among the gathered neighbours with the same unhurried, purposeful manner he brought to mending a fence or checking a gate latch, asking low, practical questions of the rider. How far upriver? How many hours since the smoke was first seen? Whether the ships had been making for the near bank or the far one, sifting what little hard fact there was from the larger, more frightening cloud of rumour and guesswork that clung to it. The truth, as it settled among them in those first tense minutes, was thin and uncertain, and none of the men gathered there pretended otherwise. No one could say with confidence how far off the danger truly was, nor whether it would come this way at all before morning. Rivers wound and bent. A raiding party's ships might follow the water for hours yet, before finding a place to land, if they meant to land near this stretch at all, and not simply pass by towards some richer target further inland. It was entirely possible, several of the older men said as much, in the low, measured tones of those trying to steady frightened neighbours, that whatever had happened at the settlement downriver would end there, and that the ships would turn back with the tide long before ever troubling this quiet stretch of Wessex. But possible was not the same as certain, and no one standing on that moonlit green was prepared to stake their children's safety on a guess. What was known, gathered from years of half-heard accounts and the grim travelling reputation of such raids, was spoken of now in low voices among the men, and Wulfric listened as much as he spoke. These raiders, when they came for what could be carried away, not for the land itself, silver where it could be found, iron tools, stores of grain, livestock that could be driven or slaughtered on the spot, and, worst of all, people themselves taken for ransom or worse. A modest farming village like this one held little enough silver to tempt a great host, but modest was not the same as safe. Smaller raiding bands were sometimes drawn to exactly such places precisely because they were poorly defended and quickly stripped. There was no Lord's Hall here with armed men to call upon, no stone walls to shelter behind. What there was instead was the accumulated, hard-earned knowledge of a community that had lived for generations under the shadow of exactly this possibility and had worked out, in the unspoken way such things are worked out, what to do when the shadow finally seemed to fall close. The church was spoken of first and dismissed almost as quickly, by the more clear-eyed among them. Sanctuary it might offer against the judgment of God. But a raiding party looking for portable wealth would think nothing of breaking through a timber door, and a building with only one way in and out was, if anything, a trap dressed up as a refuge. Father Oswin himself, fear to his credit, did not argue the point. His face in the moonlight showed the particular sorrow of a shepherd who understood that his flock's safety tonight lay less in his church than in the cover of the land itself. The woods, then, the dense stretch of woodland that rose beyond the water meadow to the south, thick enough with undergrowth and old timber to swallow a scattering of frightened families entirely from view, and threaded through with paths that no stranger to the district would easily find in darkness. And beyond even that, for those who knew the ground well, a low hollow cut by the stream, where the bank folded back on itself, hidden by alder and bramble, deep enough that a small fire's glow would not carry. A place children had played in during safer seasons without ever quite understanding why their fathers had shown it to them so carefully. It was toward this hollow and the sheltering woods around it that the low, urgent talk among the men now turned, not with panic, but with the same grim practicality Wulfric brought to every hard decision of his working life. Better to be cold and hidden and wrong than warm and exposed and wrong. One of the older men said, in words close enough to that sentiment, that they passed quickly from mouth to mouth across the green, becoming almost a kind of shared decision without anyone quite declaring it as one. Wulfric felt the shift happen in himself as much as around him, the slow, deliberate turning of a mind from domestic rhythm into something more watchful, more spare. It was not fear exactly, or not only fear, it was closer to the feeling of a man who has spent his whole life preparing, in small unconscious ways, for a night he hoped would never come, and who now found that night arriving and found himself, almost to his own surprise, ready to meet it with steady hands. He crossed the green back toward his own house with quick, unhurried steps, nodding to neighbours as he passed, exchanging low words with one man about which trackway to take, with another about whether the very old or the very young should be carried, and with a third, a widow from 2 houses down whose husband had died the previous winter, and who now stood alone in her doorway with a small child gripped tight against her hip, a brief, quiet offer to walk together when the time came, so that she would not face the dark paths alone. By the time he reached his own threshold, Ealhswith was already standing in the doorway, with a look on her face that asked the question before her voice could shape it, and he answered with the same low, steady tone he might have used to tell her that rain was coming, or that a neighbour's cow had strayed into their field, not because the news was small, but because the steadiness of his voice was itself a kind of shelter he could offer her and the children in that moment before any other shelter had been found. There would be little time now for the slow rituals of an ordinary evening. The pottage pot, still faintly warm from hours before, would have to be left, the fire banked hurriedly rather than with its usual care. Somewhere behind him, across the green, the bell had finally fallen silent, Father Oswin's hand stilled at last upon the rope, and in the sudden absence of its ringing the night seemed, for one strange moment, almost as quiet as it had been before any of this had begun. But it was not the same quiet. Wulfric could feel that, standing in his own doorway with his wife's eyes on his face and his children beginning to stir, confused and frightened from sleep behind him. Somewhere upriver, ships moved on dark water, and smoke rose from a settlement whose name he did not even know, and no one yet could say with certainty whether that same smoke would, before this night was through, rise from the very thatch above his own head. There was no more time to wonder how far off the danger truly was. There was only the work now of readying his family for the dark paths ahead, and trusting, as he had trusted the fence he mended and the gate he checked each evening without fail, that quiet, careful preparation might yet be enough to see them safely through to morning. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a household in the moment after a decision has been made, but before it has been acted upon. A silence Wulfric had never known before that night, but which he would come to recognize instantly in the years that followed, whenever fear demanded action, and there was, for one suspended breath, nothing yet to do but feel the weight of what was coming. He broke it himself, moving first, because movement was the only thing that made the silence bearable. Ealhswith was already ahead of him in some ways, her hands finding purpose before her mind had fully caught up to the shape of the night, and between them, without much need for words, the small and urgent work of choosing began. There is an old truth, rarely spoken aloud, but understood in the bones of every household that has ever faced sudden flight, that a crisis reveals with brutal clarity what a family actually values, not what they say they value, not what custom or pride might suggest, but the plain, unadorned truth of what hands reach for first when there is no time left for deliberation. For Wulfric's family, that truth expressed itself simply and without much surprise to anyone who knew them. Ealhswith went first to the small locked chest that sat at the foot of the sleeping platform, its wood dark with age, its iron hinges someone's grandfather's work, and drew from it the woolen blankets that had covered them all through countless winters past. Not all of them, for that would be too much to carry and too much to risk on paths made treacherous by darkness and haste, but two of the heaviest, the ones that would matter most if the night grew long and cold before it grew safe again. She rolled them tight and lashed them with a length of cord, her movements economical, drained of any wasted motion. The particular efficiency of a woman who had spent her whole life learning to do necessary things quickly. Wulfric, meanwhile, had gone to the small store of grain kept against the wall in a sealed wooden bin. Not the whole store, for that would have to be left to whatever fate the night decided, and there was no carrying a full winter's provision on foot through dark woodland, but a modest sack's worth, barley mostly, scooped quickly by the light of a single rushlight, tied off at the neck and slung over one shoulder. It was not much, it would not feed them for long, but it was something, a small hedge against the possibility that this flight into the woods might stretch longer than one night, and Wulfric was, as ever, a man who prepared for the version of events that asked the most of him, rather than the version that asked the least. The cooking pot presented its own small dilemma, the kind of practical calculation that might have seemed almost absurd, set against the larger danger pressing at the edges of the night, and yet mattered enormously in its own quiet way. It was heavy, awkward to carry any distance, and yet it was also the single most valuable object of iron the household possessed, worth more in raw material and craftsmanship than nearly anything else beneath their roof, and utterly irreplaceable should it be lost or stolen. A pot that had cooked every meal of Eel Swith's married life, that had belonged to her mother before her, blackened by decades of the same fire's smoke. In the end, it was left behind, reluctantly, tucked instead into the ash at the edge of the banked hearth where, if fortune held, it might simply look unremarkable among the household debris to any eye that did not know to search for it. A small act of hope disguised as practicality, the kind of quiet gamble that ran through nearly every choice made in that hurried hour. The children, meanwhile, had woken fully now into the strange, frightened alertness of the very young suddenly confronted with adult urgency they do not yet have words for. The boy, to his credit, moved with a seriousness beyond his years, pulling on his shoes without being told, wrapping the strap of an old leather satchel across his chest, into which his mother had hurriedly pressed a heel of bread and a small twist of dried apple, saved from autumn's stores. The girl was slower, caught somewhere between sleep and fear, and it was to her that Wulfric turned his attention now, crouching to her level in the dim red glow of the banked fire. She had, clutched already in one small fist, without anyone directing her to it, the small wooden cross that normally hung on a cord above the sleeping platform. A simple thing, roughly carved, worn smooth by years of small hands touching it before sleep, a gift from her grandmother that had become, in the particular way such objects do for children, something closer to a piece of herself than a mere object. Wulfric did not ask her to leave it behind, though it added nothing of practical value to what they carried. Some things, he understood without needing to reason it through, were worth carrying simply because a frightened child's hand needed something solid to hold. Within perhaps the space of a quarter hour, though it felt both shorter and immeasurably longer to everyone living through it, the family stood ready at their own threshold, blankets rolled and lashed, grain sacks slung, satchel of bread across the boy's narrow chest, the small wooden cross gripped tight in the girl's fist, and Ealhswith herself with a small bundle of her own, containing a few strips of dried meat saved back from autumn's slaughtering, a flint and steel wrapped carefully in cloth, and steel wrapped carefully in cloth, and tucked deep within her clothing, where it would not easily be seen or lost, the one small silver brooch that had been her mother's, the single object of real value the household possessed, worn now pinned inside her shift, rather than displayed as it usually was at her shoulder. Grip the dog stood at the door already, ears up, tail low but not tucked, watching the family's hurried movements with the particular anxious attention dogs show when they sense urgency in the humans they love without understanding its cause. Outside, the green had emptied of its earlier gathering, households scattering now toward their own hurried preparations, and here and there in the moonlight Wulfric could see other shapes moving between houses and pathways. The widow from 2 doors down, with her small child, now wrapped and carried against her hip exactly as promised. An older couple moving slower, supported between 2 younger neighbours, a handful of others he recognized by shape and gait more than by any clear sight of their faces in the dim light. There was no great crowd, no mass exodus of the whole village at once. Some households, weighing the same uncertain rumour and the same rough distances, chose instead to remain, banking on the chance that the danger would pass them by, or trusting some other shelter closer to hand. This, too, was simply the texture of such nights. Not one single unified action, but many small, separate decisions, each family weighing fear and hope and practical circumstance in its own way, arriving at whatever answer seemed most bearable. For Wulfric's family, and for the handful of neighbours who fell into loose, quiet step alongside them, the answer was the woods. They moved out from the green along the southern trackway, the same worn path that in daylight led toward the water meadow and the fields beyond, but which in this deep hour of night had become something else entirely. A pale, uncertain ribbon of packed earth visible mostly by memory and moonlight, its edges blurred into shadow, its surface, after days of earlier rain, softened into cold, sucking mud that pulled at every footstep. Wulfric led, not because anyone had appointed him to do so, but because he knew this ground as well as any man in the village, having walked it in every season and every weather for the whole of his adult life, and because leading was simply what a careful, watchful man did when the path ahead was uncertain and those behind him were afraid. Ealhswith came just behind, the girl's small hand gripped tight in hers. The boy close at his father's other side, old enough now to understand that his own steadiness mattered, that his sister watched him for cues on how frightened she ought to be. The cold of the night pressed close around them as they walked, the kind of damp, clinging chill that settles into low ground after dark, even in late summer, and the mud beneath their feet was a constant, unglamorous misery, cold and thick, pulling at shoes with every step, so that within a few hundred paces Wulfric's own worn leather shoes were soaked through and heavy, and he could hear, just behind him, the girl's small gasp each time her own feet sank a little too deep. No one spoke above a whisper. This too was understood without being explicitly commanded. Voices carried strangely on a still night, and no one walking that path could say with certainty how far off any danger truly lurked, nor whether sound might travel further across open water meadow than any of them wished to risk. So the only sounds were the soft, wet suck of feet in mud, the occasional muffled creak of a carried bundle shifting on someone's shoulder, and, underneath it all, the ragged edge of careful, controlled breathing. Adults trying to move quickly without moving loudly, children trying not to cry, everyone straining, without quite admitting it aloud, to hear whatever might be carried toward them on the night wind. And the wind did carry things, faint and half-formed, teasing at the edge of hearing in ways that made the whole group tense and slow without anyone needing to give the signal. Once, far off, What might have been the bark of a dog, sharp and distant, gone again before anyone could be certain it was real, and not simply their own fear giving shape to silence. Once, a low murmur that could have been voices carried strangely across the water meadow, or could have been nothing at all, wind moving through reeds near the stream. They left the open trackway where it bordered the meadow and turned instead onto a narrower path that Wulfric knew by feel more than sight, one that cut into the deeper woodland to the south. The ground here rougher, threaded with roots that caught at unwary feet, the darkness thicker beneath the canopy of ash and alder that closed in gradually overhead, blotting out even the pale moonlight that had guided them this far. Here the party slowed further still, each person's hand finding the shoulder or cloak of the one ahead, moving now almost entirely by touch and memory, until at last the ground began to dip downward in the particular way Wulfric had known it would, toward the hidden hollow where the stream folded back against its own bank, screened by a thick tangle of bramble and low alder that had grown wild and undisturbed for years, precisely because so few people ever had cause to push through it. It was here, finally, that the small party came to rest, perhaps 8 or 9 souls all told, counting children, tucked into the shadowed lee of the bank, with the cold trickle of the stream close at hand and the dense screen of undergrowth rising between them and the open meadow beyond. Bundles were set down carefully, blankets unrolled and spread as best they could be over the damp ground, children drawn close against parents for whatever warmth could be shared. No fire was lit, of course. That went without saying, though one of the younger children had to be gently, urgently hushed when she asked, in a whisper too loud for the stillness around them, why they could not simply build one the way they always did at home. Ealhswith answered her with a soft, steady murmur that seemed to satisfy the question well enough, and within moments the girl had quieted, exhaustion and fear together pulling her down into an uneasy doze against her mother's side. It was there, settled into the cold and the dark and the tense, listening stillness of the hollow, that the family first began to hear the raid itself, not as anything seen, for the dense woodland and the folded bank hid them entirely from any direct sight of the village or the paths beyond it, but only as sound, distant and fragmented. But only as sound, distant and fragmented, carried unevenly on a wind that seemed to rise and fall without pattern. A shout, once faint and short, gone almost before it registered as a shout at all rather than some trick of the wind through branches. Later, something that might have been hoofbeats, quick and hard, somewhere beyond the meadow, though whether these belonged to raiders or simply to a neighbour's loosed and frightened horse, no one crouched in that hollow could say with any certainty. Once, unmistakably, a dog barking, not Grip, who lay pressed close and silent against the boy's legs, ears flat, every muscle in his old body tensed and still, but some other dog somewhere far off, barking in short, sharp bursts that eventually trailed away into nothing. None of it resolved into anything clear. None of it told them, with any certainty, whether the ships the rider had spoken of had truly come this far upriver at all, or whether what they heard was simply the ordinary chaos of a frightened village reacting to rumor and shadow. That uncertainty was, in its own way, the hardest part of the waiting that now stretched before them. Harder, in some sense, than clear danger would have been, because clear danger could at least be met, while this formless, drifting sound asked only to be endured. Wulfric sat with his back against the cold earth of the bank, one arm around his wife, his eyes fixed on the dark tangle of bramble that screened them from the world beyond, listening to every fragment of sound the wind brought to him and turning each one over carefully, cautiously, refusing to let his mind race ahead into certainty in either direction, not toward false comfort and not toward the deeper fear that pressed always at the edges of such long, dark waiting. Beside him, the children had both, despite everything, finally slipped into the fitful shallow sleep of the exhausted young, and even Ela, Swit's breathing beside him, had begun, slowly, to settle into something calmer, though he could feel, in the far, tension still held in her shoulder against his arm, that she was as far from true rest as he was. The night stretched on around them, cold and close and full of half-heard things, and there was nothing left to do now but wait, to sit in the mud and the dark with the people who mattered most to him, gathered close, and to listen, patient and watchful, for whatever the night would finally decide to tell them. The deepest part of the night has a texture all its own, and Wulfric had come, over the slow crawl of hours in that hidden hollow, to know it intimately, not through anything he could have named, or explained to another man, but through the simple accumulation of small sensations that told him time was passing, even when nothing else seemed to move at all. The cold had settled fully into the ground by now, seeping upward through blanket and cloak alike, and the stream beside them had taken on a low, constant murmur that his ears had stopped truly hearing an hour or more before, the way a sound repeated long enough simply becomes a kind of silence in itself. Overhead, where the canopy of ash and alder thinned enough to show fragments of sky, the stars had wheeled some visible distance from where they had stood when the family first settled into the hollow, a slow, patient proof that the night, however endless it felt, was in fact moving toward its end. He had heard nothing now, he realized, for some considerable stretch of time. No shout, no distant hoofbeat, no dog barking somewhere beyond the meadow. The last such sound he could recall, a faint, broken cry that might have been a voice, or might simply have been wind finding some hollow branch to moan through, had come, he thought, perhaps a 9-hour past, though counting hours in that dark formless waiting was itself an uncertain business, more feeling than measurement. Beside him, Ealhswith's breathing had finally deepened into something closer to true sleep, her body having reached, sometime in the small hours, the point past which even fear cannot keep exhaustion fully at bay. Her head had come to rest against his shoulder, her weight settling into him by slow degrees rather than any conscious choice, and Wulfric found he did not mind the ache this brought to his own arm, held still now for so long against the cold ground beneath them. The girl slept most soundly of all 4 of them, curled into the curve of her mother's side beneath the thicker, of the two blankets, one small fist still loosely closed around the wooden cross, even in sleep, as though her fingers had simply forgotten, somewhere in the drift toward dreams, that there was any longer a need to hold it so tightly. The boy had fought sleep longer, as boys of his age often do, some part of him wanting to prove himself equal to his father's watchfulness, sitting upright with his back against the cold bank and his eyes fixed for a long while on the dark tangle of bramble that screened them from the world beyond. But even determined boys are still children beneath their determination, and somewhere in the deepest hour of the night his head had begun to nod, drooping by slow degrees until at last it had come to rest against his father's other arm. His breathing evening out into the soft, unguarded rhythm of true sleep, one hand still curled loosely around Grip's neck, where the old dog lay pressed warm against his side. Grip himself had not slept, or, if he had, it had been the light, twitching doze of an animal who keeps some part of himself always listening. Twice in the deep hours he had lifted his head sharply at some sound too faint for human ears, ears swivelling toward the dark beyond the bramble. And twice, after a long moment of stillness, he had settled again with a soft huff of breath. Whatever he had sensed, apparently judged, in whatever calculus dogs use for such things, not worth further alarm. Wulfric found himself grateful, in a quiet, wordless way, for that old dog's steady presence, not because Grip could have done anything against real danger, stiff and grey-muzzled as he was, but because an animal's calm is its own kind of reassurance, a small, living instrument by which frightened people can measure the true weight of the dark around them. He kept his own watch through those hours in the manner that suited him best, not through tense, straining vigilance, which wears a man down and clouds his judgment, but through the same patient, steady attention he brought to any long task whose end could not be hurried. He listened to the stream's low murmur. Listened to the stream's low murmur, to the occasional rustle of some small creature moving through the undergrowth beyond their hiding place, a fox perhaps, or simply wind finding a loose branch, and to the soft, layered breathing of his sleeping family, 4 different rhythms woven together into something that felt, despite everything, almost peaceful. Once, from somewhere higher in the trees above the hollow, an owl called a long low note, followed by a shorter answering call. From further off, the 2 sounds passing back and forth across the dark canopy in a pattern so unhurried, so entirely unconcerned with the small human fears crouched below, that Wulfric felt something in his own chest loosen slightly at the sound of it. Owls did not call so calmly, he told himself, in woods disturbed by armed men and burning thatch. It was a small thing to hang hope on, and he knew it even as he let himself hang it there. But small things were what the night had left him to work with. The other families sheltering nearby in the hollow had settled into their own versions of this same long stillness. The widow with her small child had found, at some point in the deep hours, a position against the bank where the child could sleep, pressed warm against her. And she herself sat now, with her head tipped back against the earth, eyes closed, though Wulfric could not tell whether she truly slept, or simply rested her eyes against the strain of so much watchful darkness, the older couple had drawn close together beneath a single shared cloak. Their two shapes merged almost into one in the dimness, and from their direction came, every so often, the faint, papery sound of the old man's breathing, laboured but steady, a small reminder that this cold ground was harder on some bodies than others. There is a particular grace in shared discomfort, quietly endured, and Wulfric felt it now, in this hollow full of half-sleeping neighbours. The sense that fear, spread thin across several huddled bodies rather than carried alone, becomes somehow more bearable, diluted by the simple presence of others choosing, in their own quiet way, to endure the same long night beside you. The blanket he shared with Ealhswith had grown damp at its edges from the ground's cold moisture, but where their bodies pressed close beneath it, a small, stubborn warmth had built and held, the kind of warmth two people generate together that neither could quite manage alone. And it struck him, in the strange, slowed clarity that deep night and long waiting sometimes bring, that this was itself a kind of answer to the fear that had driven them out here, not the absence of cold or danger, but the simple, accumulated fact of staying close, of sharing warmth and blanket and breath through the hours when nothing else could be done. Somewhere in the slow turning of those hours, he became aware that a quality of darkness around them had begun, almost imperceptibly, to change. It was not yet true dawn. He knew this well enough from long habit. The particular deceptive grey light that comes before the sky truly lightens, false dawn as it was sometimes called, when the birds have not yet begun their full chorus, but a few restless voices test the air regardless, uncertain whether the night is truly ending. A single bird called somewhere above the hollow, a thin, testing note repeated twice before falling silent again, as though even the bird itself was not yet certain the hour had come. Wulfric lifted his head slightly at the sound, feeling something in his chest shift toward cautious hope, though he did not let it settle fully, not yet, not until the sounds of danger had been absent long enough to trust. And they had been absent, he realized now, turning the memory over carefully. Long enough, he could not say the precise measure of it, not with any exactness, but it had been the better part of the night's deepest hours since he had last heard anything that might have been shout or hoofbeat or distant dog, long enough that the silence itself had begun to feel less like no minist dog held breath and more like simple ordinary night. He did not wake the others yet. There was no need for haste now, and haste after such a night seemed almost a kind of disrespect to the careful patience that had gotten them this far. Instead, he sat a while longer in the thinning dark, listening to the small, testing calls of birds beginning to multiply above the canopy, feeling the first faint change in the air's temperature that sometimes comes just before true light, and allowing himself cautiously to believe that the worst of this long night's danger had, in fact, already passed them by. Beside him, Ealhswith stirred, her breathing changing rhythm in the particular way that precedes waking, and after a moment her eyes opened, finding his in the grey half-light with a question that did not need to be spoken aloud. He answered it with nothing more than a small, steady nod, and felt her shoulders pressed against his, loosened by some small but unmistakable measure. The children would wake soon enough, stiff and confused and hungry, and there would be the careful, unhurried business of deciding when it was truly safe to move, of waiting perhaps a while longer yet for full daylight before venturing back along the muddy trackway toward whatever the village had become in their absence. But for now, in this thin grey hour between the deepest dark and true morning, there was only this: 4 bodies warmed together beneath a damp blanket, an old dog's steady breathing at their feet, an old dog's steady breathing at their feet, the stream's low murmur beside them, and, somewhere above the dark canopy, the first uncertain voices of birds beginning, cautiously, to welcome a morning that had, against all the night's fears, finally come. True dawn came slowly, the way it always did in that low country near the river, not as a sudden brightening, but as a gradual thinning of grey into something paler, something that finally let colour creep back into the world, the dark bramble around the hollow, resolving first into deep green, then the pale trunks of the birches beyond it, catching the first true light, and at last, high above, a sky gone, the soft washed blue of early morning. Wulfric had waited for this fullness of light deliberately, though every part of him had wanted to move sooner. A man moving through half-lit woodland could stumble into danger as easily as safety, and he was not willing to risk his family on a guess when patience cost so little more. When at last he judged the light sufficient, he woke Ealhswith with a hand at her shoulder, and together they woke the children gently, the girl first stirring with a small confused frown before memory found her, the boy waking already half alert, in the way children do after a night that has taught them too early to be watchful. Grip was on his feet before any of them, tail low but moving, nose lifted toward the thinning trees as though testing the morning air for anything the night might have left behind. The walk back was slower than the walk out had been, though the danger, or the fear of it, had mostly drained from their steps. The mud along the trackway had begun to stiffen slightly with the night's cold, and the water meadow, when they came to its edge, lay hung with a soft morning mist that caught the early light and turned it faintly gold, so that for a moment the ordinary field looked almost unfamiliar, softened and strange. No one spoke much as they walked. There was a kind of held breath in all of them still, a reluctance to hope too plainly before hope had been earned by sight. The other families from the hollow fell into loose step alongside them, the widow with her child now walking on her own small legs again, tugging at her mother's hand with the resilience only the very young seemed to fully possess after a hard night. The older couple moved more slowly, leaning on each other and on a neighbour's arm, but they moved, and that alone seemed a small, unspoken cause for gratitude among the group. The village, when it came into view at last past the last stand of Ulder, did not look the way Wulfric had feared it might in his most careful, unspoken imaginings through the long night. No blackened ruin, no roofless husks smoking against the morning sky. The roofs stood as they had stood the evening before, thatch grey-brown and ordinary, smoke already beginning to rise thin and pale from one or two hearths where braver or more anxious households had returned before them and begun tentatively the work of relighting fires banked too hastily the night before. It was not untouched, though. As they came closer, the marks of the night's disturbance showed themselves in smaller, quieter ways. The gate of the communal storehouse, near the green, stood broken from its hinge, swinging slightly in the morning breeze, and within, Wulfric could see even from a distance that sacks of grain had been dragged and torn, some spilled across the floor, others simply gone. A pen further along stood empty, its rail split, 2 goats missing that had been counted safe the evening before. Someone's chickens had scattered wide across the green, and the woman was already moving slowly among the grass, murmuring softly, coaxing them back with handfuls of scattered grain. This Wulfric understood. Standing at the edge of the green with his family close around him was very much what such a night usually left behind, when it left anything behind at all. Not fire and ruin for their own sake, but theft, quick and practical, the sort that came from men interested in what could be carried away rather than what could be destroyed. Silver, tools, grain, livestock. These were what such raiders sought. Silver, tools, grain, livestock. These were what such raiders sought, and where village held little of the first, they simply took what there was of the rest and moved on before dawn could bring resistance or discovery. It was, in its bleak way, a mercy. The storehouse could be mended, the scattered grain swept up and salvaged where it hadn't spoiled in the mud, the goats perhaps still findable if they'd simply broken loose rather than been driven off. Roofs stood, walls stood, and this the thought that settled heaviest and most gratefully in Wulfric's chest as he looked around the green. Every face he could see among the returning families was a face he recognized, drawn and tired, but present. The work of the morning began almost before anyone spoke of beginning it, in the way that necessary work always does among people long practiced in hardship. Wulfric set down the grain sack he'd carried through the night and went first to his own house, finding the door as they'd left it, the banked hearth cold now but undisturbed, the black iron pot still tucked safely in its nest of ash, exactly where he'd hidden it. He knelt and worked the coals back to life with the same patient care he brought to every fire he'd ever built, coaxing a thread of smoke, then a small tongue of flame, feeding it slowly with kindling until the familiar warmth began, once more, to fill the room. Ealhswith moved past him to check the kitchen garden, finding it trampled in one corner but mostly whole, and called the children to help gather what vegetables had survived, work that gave small hands something useful to do with the last of their nervous energy. Outside, similar small labours were underway across the whole green, men working the broken storehouse gate back onto its hinge, women sweeping spilled grain into salvageable piles, sorting the ruined from the recoverable, a boy not much older than Wulfric's own son leading a found goat back toward its pen, the animal trotting along with the unbothered indifference goats often show toward the larger dramas of human fear. Father Oswin appeared on the green sometime in the mid-morning, moving slowly among the households with quiet words for each. And by the time the sun had climbed higher and the mist had burned fully off the meadow, the church bell rang once more, softly this time, unhurried, the familiar rhythm restored, calling the village together, not for warning now, but for something gentler. Mino, but for something gentler, a gathering of simple thanks that most of the households drifted toward without needing to be told twice. They stood together on the worn grass before the church, tired and mud-streaked and dishevelled, and Father Oswin spoke only briefly, his voice carrying easily in the morning stillness words of gratitude for safety granted, for a night endured, for neighbours who had walked out together into the dark and walked back together into the light. Wulfric stood with his family close around him, Ealhswith's hand loosely in his, the boy's shoulder pressed against his side, the girl half asleep on her feet despite the morning hour. Crip settled at their feet with his head resting on his paws. He felt, standing there, something he did not have easy words for. Not triumph, not relief exactly, though relief was certainly part of it, but something quieter and more worn, the particular tiredness of a man who has done what needed doing and finds, now that it's done, that his body remembers every hour of it at once. Later that day, once the storehouse gate was mended and the last of the scattered grain gathered, once the goats had been found and counted and the chickens coaxed back into their coop, Wulfric returned to his own house and found Ealhswith already at the hearth again. The pottage pot hung once more above a steady flame, the smell of barley and leeks beginning, slowly to fill the room the way it always had. He sat on the low bench, feeling the ache in every muscle from the night's long vigil, and watched the smoke rise, thin and pale and ordinary, through the hole in the roof above, curling up into an afternoon sky, gone soft and blue and utterly unremarkable. It was, he thought, watching that small column of smoke drift skyward, a very small thing to have survived for, a hearth, a pot of barley, a roof that kept the rain out. And yet it was, he understood now more clearly than he ever had before, everything. Across the wider land of Wessex that same season, in villages whose names Wulfric would never know, other families were living some version of this same night, the smoke on the wind, the bell rung, the hurried packing of blankets and grain and small wooden cross, the long cold waiting in some hidden hollow or thicket, and, for many though not all, the same quiet, grateful walk home through morning mist to find a roof still standing and a hearth still worth relighting. It was not a story that would be written down, not the kind that found its way into chronicles or songs. It was simply one ordinary family's night among countless such nights, remembered only by those who had lived it, and perhaps that was its own kind of quiet monument, smoke rising steady from a roof hole once more, curling peacefully into the wide morning sky. The morning after the raiders, by the time the sky begins to pale over the eastern fields, the village is quieter than it has ever been, not peaceful. Not yet, but quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after everyone has spent the night, listening for sounds that never came. A few people have slept in the woods, others have stayed hidden in ditches, barns, hedges, and small patches of marsh where the reeds rise high enough to conceal a crouching body. Some never left their homes at all. They simply barred the door, put out the fire, and waited in darkness while every small creak in the timber sounded much louder than it should. Now, with the first grey light of morning, people begin to move. Slowly at first, no one walks straight into the centre of the village. A man steps out from behind a hedge and stands still for a moment. Looking toward the roofs, a woman appears farther down the lane, holding a wool cloak tightly around her shoulders. Somewhere near the stream, a dog begins barking, then stops when it recognizes a familiar voice. This is how the village returns to itself. Not all at once, one person at a time. The first thing people do is look for one another. A name is called across the road. Then another. Someone answers from behind a fence. Someone else emerges from an outbuilding, stiff from sleeping on packed earth. There are embraces, quiet questions, and long pauses where people simply look at one another, relieved to see a familiar face. For ordinary villagers, surviving a raid is not only about escaping the moment of danger, it is also about discovering what remains when the danger has passed. A household might begin by returning to its home. The door may still be standing. The roof may still be intact. But inside, small things can tell the story of what happened. A storage chest has been opened. A clay pot is broken. A bundle of cloth has been moved. A wooden bowl lies upside down near the wall. Nothing here would look especially valuable to a king, but to the family who lives in this house, almost everything has a purpose. The iron knife used every day at meals, the wool blanket that took months of work to produce, the small bronze buckle that once belonged to a parent, the dried grain stored for the weeks when the fields offer nothing. Even a simple cooking pot matters. Replacing it is not as easy as walking to a shop. There is no shop waiting. At the end of the road, there is only the next market day, the next travelling craftsman, the next neighbour willing to trade, or the next season when enough surplus can finally be spared. And so the villagers begin to count. Not coins, things. How much grain remains? How many chickens are still in the yard? Whether the cow has wandered off? Whether the small iron tools are still where they were left? Whether the winter cloak is gone? Whether the household chest has been disturbed? Whether the door can still close? These are the measurements that determine what the next few weeks will feel like. A village in 9th century England is built on margins that can be surprisingly thin. A household does not need to lose everything to be placed in real difficulty. A missing animal can mean less milk. Less milk means less butter and cheese. A stolen sack of grain means smaller meals. A broken fence may allow livestock to wander into crops. A damaged roof can turn the next rainstorm into a serious problem. So the work begins almost immediately. There is no long period of standing around and discussing what should happen. Next, the sun rises. People are alive. There is work to do. Two men lift a fallen section of fence back into place. A woman gathers scattered grain from the floor of a storehouse, separating dirt from whatever can still be saved. Someone leads a frightened goat back from the edge of the woods. Another villager walks down toward the stream with two empty buckets. An older woman relights a hearth and places a small pot above the flame. The fire matters. After a night of fear, the return of an ordinary cooking fire changes the feeling of a house. Smoke begins to rise toward the roof opening. Water warms. A little steam appears above the pot. For the first time since the alarm began, the village begins to smell like itself again. Wood smoke, wet earth, animals, porridge, wool, the familiar smells of ordinary life. And those ordinary things are important because they remind everyone that the village is not only the place where something frightening happened, it is still home. If the raiders took food, neighbors may share what they have, not because everyone has plenty. Usually they do not, but a village depends on relationships. The household with 2 cows may lend milk. The family with an extra sack of oats may spare a little. Someone who has lost a cooking pot may borrow one. Someone whose door was damaged may receive help from a carpenter, or simply from neighbors who know how to work timber. These exchanges are not always written down. There is no ledger hanging in the middle of the village. People remember. They remember who helped repair a roof, who shared seed grain, who watched another family's animals, who gave food when there was little to give. Later, when the harvest comes, or a pig is slaughtered, or a fresh batch of ale is fresh batch of ale, brewed, those favours may return. This is one of the quiet strengths of village life. A household is important, but no household is truly alone. By mid-morning, the village church becomes part of the recovery. The building may be small, perhaps timber, perhaps stone if the settlement is prosperous, or connected to an older religious site. The bell, if there is one, does not ring with the urgency of the night before. This time, it calls people together. Some stand inside. Others remain near the doorway. There may be a prayer of thanks for those who return safely. There may be prayers for neighbors who have not yet returned. There may be no grand speech. Only tired people, mud on shoes, smoking clothing, and the quiet sound of familiar prayers. For people living in Anglo-Saxon England, faith is woven into the rhythm of life. The church marks marriages, baptisms, fast days, feast days, harvests, deaths, and moments of fear. To the villagers, the world is not divided neatly between the practical and the spiritual. A repaired fence and a spoken prayer can belong to the same morning. Afterward, people return to the lane. There is still work to do. A few villagers travel beyond the settlement to look for animals. Tracks in the wet ground can reveal where livestock ran during the night. A cow may be found in a meadow half a mile away. Sheep may cluster together near a hedgerow. A horse, if one escaped, may have followed the road or hidden near woodland. Finding animals becomes one of the most urgent tasks because livestock are not simply possessions. They are food, labor, clothing, fertilizer, and future wealth. A cow is milk today and calves tomorrow. Sheep provide wool. Oxen pull the plough. Pigs turn woodland into food by feeding Croston woodland into food by feeding on acorns and whatever else they can find. To recover an animal is to recover part of a household's future, and so people search, they call. They listen for bells tied around animals' necks. They follow hoofprints. They push branches aside. They search the edges of fields and woodland. Eventually, a shout travels back toward the village. Someone has found 2 sheep. It is a small victory, but small victories matter. By afternoon, the settlement looks different than it did at dawn. The broken things are still broken, but some are being repaired. A new plank has been placed across a damaged door. A roof has been patched with fresh thatch. Scattered straw has been gathered. The lane is busy again, and inside one house a meal is being prepared. Probably not a feast, nothing dramatic. Something simple, oats or barley simmered into a thick porridge. Perhaps onions, maybe leeks, a little cheese, if there is enough. Perhaps a small piece of smoked meat, divided carefully, so everyone receives some. Bread, if there is bread. Ale, as common at the table as almost anything else. People eat slowly. They are tired. Some tell the story of where they hid. Someone says they heard voices near the road. Someone else insists the raiders moved toward the river. Another person says almost nothing. The details do not agree perfectly. They rarely do. That is what fear can do to memory. One person remembers 10 riders. Another is certain there were 20. Someone remembers torchlight. Someone else remembers the night being almost completely dark. Over time, these separate memories begin to become one village story. Years from now, people who were not there may still hear about the night. Everyone fled toward the marsh or hid in the woods. The story may grow, details may change. A barking dog may become the dog that warned the entire village. A man who merely saw movement near the road may eventually become the first person who spotted the raiders. A man who merely saw movement near the road may eventually become the first person who spotted the raiders. A few torches may become a whole line of fire moving through the darkness. That is how memory works. The history of kings is recorded by scribes and chroniclers, but the history of villages lives in voices, at firesides, at meals, on winter evenings, while repairing tools, while walking cattle home. For most ordinary people, that spoken memory is the history they know best. Far beyond this settlement, the year 878 is becoming one of the most important years in Anglo-Saxon history. Kings and armies are moving. Fortified places matter. Messengers carry news from one estate to another. Rumors travel faster than certainty. People speak the name of Alfred. Others speak of Viking armies that have already transformed kingdoms farther north. But here those enormous events arrive slowly. A traveller may bring news. A priest may hear something from another church. A Lord's messenger may pass along the road. The villagers do not receive a neat explanation of everything happening across England. They receive fragments. A victory, a defeat, a treaty, a rumour, another army seen somewhere far away. To people living here, history does not feel like a chapter in a book. It feels uncertain. The future is hidden. No one knows which rumour will prove true. No one knows whether raiders will return. No one knows whether the next month will be quiet. And yet, the fields still have to be tended. That may be one of the strangest things about living through dangerous times. Ordinary life does not stop simply because history has become dramatic. Seeds still need to go into the ground. Animals still need water. Bread still needs to be made. Roofs still leak. Shoes still wear out. Wood still needs to be gathered. The day after fear can look surprisingly similar to the day before it. And perhaps that is one of the ways people endure. Not by becoming fearless, but by returning to routine. In the days that follow, the village becomes more watchful. A man working near the edge of the fields looks toward the road more often than before. Someone repairing a fence pauses when birds suddenly rise from the trees. Dogs are listened to carefully. Sounds seem to carry farther at night. A traveller approaching after sunset may cause several doors to close until someone recognizes him. The church bell takes on a different meaning. Before, it marked worship and time. Now everyone remembers what it sounded like when it rang in warning. Some villagers begin quietly discussing where they would go if danger returned. Which path leads fastest to the woods? Which stretch of marsh is safest? Which building has the strongest door? Where animals could be driven? Where sacks of grain could be hidden? People learn from what happened. They move important objects. They keep certain possessions closer. They listen differently. And little by little, the fear becomes less immediate. One evening passes without alarm. Then another. Then a week. The moon slowly changes shape. Rain falls. The lane becomes muddy again. Travellers begin appearing on the road. Someone arrives carrying salt. Another brings news from a neighbouring settlement. A smith visits and repairs a damaged tool. The world begins expanding again beyond the edges of the village. And eventually, laughter returns. At first, it may feel strange. Perhaps it may feel strange. Perhaps someone tells a story while repairing a roof. Perhaps a bucket slips from someone's hand at the well and splashes water everywhere. Perhaps a goat escapes from its pen and runs directly through the garden that was just repaired that morning. Whatever the reason, one person laughs, then another, and soon the sound travels across the yard. That sound matters almost as much as the church bell, because it means the village is becoming ordinary again. As evening settles, fires begin to glow behind doorways. The lane darkens. Smoke drifts gently above the thatched roofs. A woman carries the last bucket of water inside. A man checks the gate around the livestock. Someone places another piece of wood onto the hearth. A dog circles twice before lying down near the warmth. Inside one house, the family prepares to sleep. The same walls surround them, the same roof. the same packed earth floor, but everything feels slightly different now. The darkness outside is no longer simply darkness, it contains memory. A distant sound may make someone open their eyes. A barking dog may create a moment of silence. But nothing follows. The fire settles lower. The room becomes warm. Someone pulls a blanket higher over their shoulders. Another person whispers a short prayer. And eventually, even the most watchful person begins to drift towards sleep. This is the part of history that chronicles rarely describe. Not the battle, not the king, not the treaty, but the quiet return, the rebuilding, the sharing of food, the search for animals, the repaired roof, the first ordinary meal, the first night that passes without alarm. For people living in England in 878, those small moments could mean everything, because survival is not only escaping danger, it is waking the next morning and beginning again. But morning does not erase what happened. In the days that follow, each household begins making choices about what can be repaired now and what must wait. A damaged stool may remain in the corner. A cracked storage jar may be bound with cord and used for something less important. A missing cloak may be replaced with an older one that no longer fits very well. Nothing is wasted if it can still serve. That habit matters in a world where almost everything is made by hand. A missing tool may slow an entire season. A cracked bucket is tightened with a new band. Families keep one another closer. Doors stay open during the day so voices can be heard. Neighbors notice who has not passed along the lane. Even silence becomes something people pay attention to. At night, some households sleep lightly. A man may wake because a branch strikes the roof. A woman may sit up when a dog growls in its sleep. Someone checks the door bar twice before lying down. This nervousness does not mean the village has stopped functioning. It means people are adjusting. Fear can become part of routine without completely controlling it. And routine slowly begins to win. The fields need attention. If the season is right, seed must be protected. If grain has already been planted, weeds must be pulled. If harvest is approaching, everyone knows there is little time to waste. A raid does not persuade the weather to wait. Rain comes when it comes. Cold arrives when it arrives. The sun rises whether anyone is ready or not. That fact can be harsh, but it can also be strangely comforting. Nature continues. The seasons continue, and the villagers continue with them. A few days later, someone may walk to a neighboring Perth settlement. The journey is not long, but it feels more serious now. The traveler carries news. He explains what happened. He asks whether anyone else saw raiders on the road. He listens for reports of ships, horses, armed men, or smoke in the distance. News spreads this way, person to person, village to village, estate to estate. Much of it is incomplete, some of it is wrong, but even uncertain information can shape behavior. If another settlement reports strangers moving nearby, people become cautious again. If travelers say the roads are quiet, tension eases. The village lives between rumor and observation. What people know for certain is what they can see with their own eyes: the repaired gate, the smoke from a neighbor's roof, the returning sheep, the familiar face approaching along the path. These small certainties begin to matter more than distant stories. There is also the question of what to remember. The raid will not disappear from the village's memory. Someone will always mention the night the bell rang. A scar on a door may remain for years. A replacement roof may be darker than the older thatch around it. A family may remember the animal they never found. Another may remember the neighbor who shared food when their own stores were gone. Memory settles into places. A tree near the marsh becomes the tree where someone hid. A bend in the stream becomes the place where a frightened horse was found. A patch of woodland becomes the place where several households waited until dawn. These places look ordinary again. But to those who were there, they are not ordinary at all. They carry stories. As weeks pass, those stories become less urgent and more familiar. People tell them while working. They correct one another. No, the correct one. Another. No, the correct one. Riders came from the west. No, the bell rang before the dog started barking. No, it was raining by then. No, the rain came later. Memory is never perfectly neat, but the village keeps telling the story because telling it gives shape to something that once felt chaotic, and eventually the raid becomes part of the village's past rather than its present. That change is difficult to notice when it happens. There is no single morning when everyone wakes and decides they are no longer afraid. Instead, fear fades in small pieces. A door is left open after sunset. A child laughs near the road. A woman walks alone to the stream. A man hears hoofbeats and does not immediately reach for a tool or weapon. Someone spends an entire afternoon thinking about the harvest instead of the raid. Then an evening passes where nobody mentions it at all. That may be the clearest sign that ordinary life has returned. Not because the village has forgotten. Not because the village has forgotten, but because memory no longer fills every silence. And with each ordinary day, the settlement becomes itself again. The hearths burn. The animals are fed. The fields change colour. Rain darkens the thatch. Smoke drifts above the roofs. People argue, trade, pray, work, rest, and laugh. The great struggles of kings and armies continue beyond the horizon. But here, life is measured in smaller things. A loaf that rises properly, a fence that holds, a cow that returns, a roof that does not leak, a neighbor who knocks before entering, a quiet road at dusk, a full water bucket beside the hearth. And perhaps, after everything that happened, those small things feel more precious than before, because the villagers now understand how quickly ordinary life can be interrupted. They also understand how stubbornly it can return. So when evening comes, once more they prepare for sleep. The fire is banked, the door is secured, the last cup is set aside. Outside, the village settles beneath the stars. Outside, the village settles beneath the stars. No warning bell rings. No dogs bark toward the road. Only the wind moves through the grass. Only the stream continues beside the fields. Only the stream continues beside the fields, and in the darkness the people of the village rest, knowing that for one more night home has held, and as the village settles beneath the dark sky, the stream continues moving past the fields exactly as it did before. Water slips around stones, reeds move gently in the wind. A faint light remains in one window, then another goes dark. The roofs become dark shapes beneath the stars. The animals settle. The last conversation fades, and somewhere in the distance, an owl calls softly from the trees. The village is still there, changed, more cautious, more aware of the world beyond its fields, but still there. And for tonight, that is enough.